I am a normal professor with a normal pay and status and teaching, even though I am a threat to the safety of my students. Somehow I'm still around. You go explain that one for me.
Hello and welcome to the Americano show. Today I am delighted to be joined by Amy Wax, who is Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, still Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, I should say, even though she has been publicly suspended and had other sanctions imposed on her for her views, for her statements about gender or sex, I should say, biological sex and race. Amy, I think we probably, for our viewers and listeners, we should probably get into the various accusations against you at some point. But I thought I might start by saying I've been quite struck that there are quite a few people who stand up for free speech or seem to stand up for free speech in America who have decided that you have crossed their line. And I noticed that John McWhorter wrote a piece in the New York Times, I think it was yesterday. And John McWhorter, I think, signed that Harpers letter defending free speech, which was quite a big story a couple of years ago. And he has described you as outrageous, demeaning and dangerous, but she shouldn't be punished. This seems to be their line, that you've crossed the line, but you shouldn't be punished. Do you feel that these people have turned on you?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very broad generalization. A lot of the people who, have failed to defend me are what they call these days woke, and therefore their professions of support for free speech are, bogus and insincere, or they don't even purport to really defend free speech. I mean, there's tons of people who wouldn't even say that, I should not be punished because of academic freedom or free speech. Or they might say that about someone else that they agree with, like pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian spokespeople, but they wouldn't say it for me. So there's people who are all over the map, and there's just a tremendous amount of confusion, I think. I did read John McWhorter's piece. John and I were friends for a very long time. We haven't seen each other, I think, since COVID. And I'd love to see him again. I'm surprised at some of the things he says in that piece. I'm grateful for the fact that he says I shouldn't be punished. That means that he does understand the basic core of free speech and academic free expression. But for him to call what I say demeaning, or that it somehow undermines trust, a lot of that is puzzling. The word truth never appears in his op-ed. And I find that striking. He says, what I said about Black student performance undermines trust. Well, usually it was falsehoods that undermined trust back in the good old days, and truth that supported trust. Now they've turned that completely on its head. Whether what I said is true or not seems completely irrelevant. And in that respect, that is a little bit disappointing in what John McWhorter says. There are aspects of the various things that have been written about me that I have to part company with. I have to disagree with, even if the bottom line is, oh, she shouldn't have been punished. People seem to feel the need to signal. Oh, and he said something else that I found astonishing. He said, much of what Amy Wax says, most reasonable people would reject. And where does he get that? I mean, has he taken a worldwide survey or even a countrywide survey? He seems to forget that 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. Well, what are they thinking? I'm not saying they agree with me, but I am saying that they don't agree with the woke catechism and dogma on campus. In fact, probably a lot of them are rejecting that. and that's why they're voting for Trump. I think John McWhorter needs to get out more. That would mean, so I have my issues with a lot of what is being written.
I suppose what I was getting at, and you're quite right that I was being too broad and vague, but is that there is an anti-woke movement in the media in America that's quite a liberal anti-woke movement, and they would agree that shouldn't be punished, but they do, as you say, they want a signal that they are horrified by your views, and that in itself is woke.
Well, that's a form of virtue signaling, of course. I'm not saying whether they sincerely agree with that or not. But there does seem to be this need to say she's awful, she's dangerous, she's demeaning, she's bigoted, she's racist. I mean, all the whole litany before they say, but we have to let her say these things or we can't punish her for saying these things. And I mean, insofar as that goes, I guess I agree with it. But where do all these labels come from? They're very carelessly tossed around. What does the word racist mean? I haven't gotten a straight answer on that ever. Okay. When I ask people when you're calling me racist, can you define racist? And they can't. So, there's a lot of sloppiness of thought, and a lot of carelessness in labeling people, and a number of the allegations, a critical number of allegations against me, mainly what students reported that I said. I don't deny anything I said in the media, although little sound bites are lifted from what I said in the media to distort what I say. That is a routine thing that happens. Okay. But many of the statements that students made about me are just fabrications. I mean, they're things I never said. Students have a fertile imagination and they mishear things. And no one has corrected that. The due process I've gotten that's supposed to get at the truth is a joke. Okay. It is, can't even claim to be due process. I mean, there's just a lot of aspects of the way I've been treated that are not liberal at all. That's really what I'm trying to say to you, is you may think there's a liberal turn in the media on the bottom line of let's let people say these awful things. I think some of it is October 7th fallout, because there is a double standard, right? When I'm punished, but people who say, let's wipe out Israel, genocide wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, people really are saying stuff like that. They get off scot-free under the guise of academic freedom. So I think there's a little bit of discomfort with that among thinking people, but not the core of the opinions I express. They are not what reasonable people would think. To quote John McWhorter, reasonable people can't be immigration restrictionists. Reasonable people can't believe that we should preserve the core of our Anglo-Protestant culture. Reasonable people can't believe, that Enoch Powell was a prophet without honor. I mean, you could just go through a laundry list of opinions I've stated in the media, and they are good people don't hold those views.
You mentioned the accusations against you, not just for things you've said, but for your sort of behaviour as a professor. Can we just sort of go through? We don't have to go through all of it, but just go through what you've been accused of by the University of Pennsylvania, their most egregious accusations, and your response to them.
Well, they really fall into two buckets. I mean, one is, my media statements, some of which have been very severely distorted and twisted. They can't just go with what I actually say. I think they're basically insecure about that because that's supposed to be protected, right? They have to make it look worse than it is. And there's that stuff, and I don't really deny anything I've said in the media, and I stand by it. And then there's stuff that, they've put out an all cars call to students to try and come up with as much dirt as they can on me. And what you get are these flimsy, isolated, very stale allegations, some of which are just made up. So I'll give you an example, because if I go through all of them, it'll take too much time. All right. So I'll give you two examples that came out in the hearing that was held, the sort of clown car hearing that was held in my case a year ago. And none of this stuff was even in the written allegations. I mean, this is stuff they dredged up at the very last minute. I'm not sure why, but one 30-something female graduate of Penn Law, Black woman, came in and said, well, every day in civil procedure, first year course that I taught, very technical course, Wax would come in and she would rant about race for the first 15 minutes. She would rant about her book on race. This was, of course, in 2007. My book wasn't even written until 2009. And no other student claimed that. No other student corroborated it. It was just completely out of the blue. It never happened. And then this student volunteered that she was having mental health problems her first year and even hallucinating a bit. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. When the hearing board heard this, they didn't weigh it and evaluate it the way, one properly should under due process. They just said, we believe everything that these students who testified against Wax said, everything. No further analysis. All right. Another student claimed that I said, Mexicans are more likely to rape women than white people. I mean, I think she got me confused with Trump. I don't know. But I never said anything remotely like that. She took this out of a lesson in civil procedure where I was explaining that the Supreme Court rule that jury deliberations can't be inquired into except for racial discrimination allegations, very narrow exception. I said that really shouldn't be expanded to national stereotyping. And actually the situation in the case was some juror had said that Mexican men are more likely to harass women. I said, well, that's a national stereotype. It's like saying Germans are punctual, and I'm not sure we want to widen the exception. Well, that was kind of a fine point of law. And it got translated into Professor Wax says that Mexican men rape women. I mean, I'm sorry. That is a complete distortion that a not very bright law student, extrapolated from a pretty subtle legal point. It was that sort of thing. And, no attempt to evaluate its credibility, no attempt to weigh it in the proper fashion. The hearing board just said, if the student said she said that, she said that. So there's a whole series. I could go on and on. I won't. In that vein, all right, of bizarre, preposterous allegations of things I said that, are kind of second cousin to what I actually said, or third cousin, but entirely changed the meaning of what I said. Even with like one little word, or leaving out a word or two, or just twisting it a little bit. And that's the evidence against me.
Is it because you're a professor of law, and particularly when people are talking about race and applying the law to issues of race and so on, it's almost impossible now to do so because you have to wade through these huge thickets of sensitivities?
Well, that's a great way of putting it. Huge thickets of sensitivity. And,
yeah.
If you go look at the Supreme Court's First Amendment jurisprudence, and, once again, we're a private university. We're not bound by the First Amendment, although I will say, and this is quite important, our now deposed president, Liz McGill, did say to Congress under oath, we voluntarily adhere to First Amendment standards. Well, that is a promise under oath that should be taken seriously, right? And it has been violated right and left. Okay. But if you look at the First Amendment jurisprudence of the court, it is pretty damn good. They have really been quite rigorous and quite consistent in what they say. And one of the things they say is that the First Amendment does not allow something called a heckler's veto. Well, what is a heckler's veto? Heckler's veto is like a pillar of woke ideology that if the listener or the hearer is upset or offended, or you hurt their feelings, or they're somehow psychologically traumatized by what you say, or they claim to be, then you can be shut down, you can be silenced, you can be punished, right? And that, that is what we have on campus. We have on campus a great, big, fat, enormous heckler's veto, backed up by the students, backed up by the administration, backed up by the, the academic hegemony of all of these far lefty progressive types who are incredibly solicitous of the feelings and sensibilities of particular sacred groups, not all groups, because you can say hideous things about Jews and that's protected by academic freedom, but not anything negative at all about, let's say, Blacks or Hispanics. And you can't challenge what I call the bias narrative, which is another pillar of wokeness, right? The bias narrative is every bad thing, every disparity, every discrepancy, every inequality and inequity where sacred minorities lag behind is due to discrimination and racism. It is never due to people's choices, people's behaviors, anything that they themselves do. It's never due to kind of any form of self-sabotage or, bad conduct. Never, never, never. And if you violate that, and I have violated that multiple times, and that's just standard issue conservative opinion, right? I mean, that's just Thomas Sowell, Glenn Loury, other critics of the woke bias narrative, then that gets you punished on campus. It's really astonishing. That was part of the indictment against me. Amy Wax dared to say that Blacks could do more to improve their own circumstances. That's part of my indictment.
Do you think the problem is that we, people in the media certainly, and institutions, universities and so on, as Western society, I suppose, we've become more stupid? And certainly our attention spans have gone. I mean, I know I can't talk, I can't read a legal document, but is it an inability to think through information? And have you noticed students, I noticed one thing you called them sheeple, are students becoming more stupid in the way that they approach subjects?
Well, I mean, they're not really becoming more stupid in the IQ sense of just raw horsepower, because the time frame has been kind of too short for that. But they are becoming less critical, more ignorant, less curious, less able to, maintain sustained attention because of, I guess, all the media habits really undermine that, erode that. There was recently a piece on the internet about how students can't even read a whole book. I think fewer and fewer people are reading books, can't follow a sustained argument. Really, I have seen, even in the 30 years that I've been teaching law, a real deterioration in the ability to just think analytically, just standard issue thinking analytically, weighing evidence, weighing counter arguments, being willing to listen to counter arguments. There are so many, it's such a minefield in terms of what you're allowed to think, what you're allowed to say. It's become, the Overton window has become so narrow that it's gotten to the point where it really impedes people's ability and the ability and willingness to think. And in that sense, absolutely, people have gotten more stupid. I mean, when I go back to, and the things they're aware of, I mean, they are unaware of so many more things. They know so much less. That's our education system. That's our K through 12 system, which is hostile to learning content, right? Which is so important to being able to think. You have to have something to think about. Okay. But when I go back to my college education, which was the early 70s, and even further back to my K through 12 experience in a very kind of middling town in upstate New York, not particularly distinguished schools, it was so far superior to what is going on now. I've been going around giving a talk called The Radical Reactionary, How We Should Change K through 12. Here's how we should change K through 12. Go back to 1955 and do everything that they were doing in Troy, New York in 1955. Okay. As dull and as unfashionable as it is, we were memorizing poetry, we were diagramming sentences, we were, learning facts about geography, capitals, rivers, the products of all the different countries in Africa. I mean, really, oppressive stuff. It would be regarded as oppressive today. And yet we have that storehouse now, right? And it's not only what we were learning, it's what we weren't learning. We weren't learning anything about sex. Totally forbidden. Nothing. Zero. Okay? If you ever asked about anything, and most kids knew better then too, they would immediately say, ask your parents. Right? That's not our bailiwick. It's not our wheelhouse. That's not what we're here for. And of course, the recognition was this belonged to private life. True diversity, people have different views, different opinions. The parents are entitled to pass their view of these things on to their children, or at least to try, and the government should not be doing it or interfering with it. Well, when you say these things now, people look at you like, you're so backward. No, I actually think that was a far better model.
Do you think you have become radicalized, though? Because in a lot of the pieces I've read about you, and this would be the sort of anti-woke but a bit shocked groupings, they say, they sort of seem to like you when you were talking about bourgeois values, but they think that you've become more hard line on race. They mention you inviting Jared Taylor, who's called a white supremacist, to a seminar, and the sort of view is that, I think as the Bulwark put it, you've become a right-wing troll. Do you think you've been, obviously that's abusive, and I'm not putting that to you, but do you think you've become radicalised in the last 5 to 10 years?
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, I mean, first of all, they didn't like me when I was praising bourgeois values either. All right. They didn't like the fact that I was praising the 1950s. That is like verboten. Okay. That pushes all their buttons. So this has been going on for a very long time, just as the rise in woke and these far left progressive ideas are, have been coming on for a very long time. I often say to people, beware, because the left gets to decide what words you can use, what concepts are acceptable, what extremism is. They're the ones who have the cultural power. They occupy the commanding heights of the culture. And so what they say goes. And frankly, I reject all of that. I just reject their little geography of, whose opinions are extreme, whose opinions are not extreme, what opinions are acceptable, what are not. I mean, they try to control that discourse, and I push back. I'll give you an example. So in my podcast with Richard Hanania a couple of days ago, which lasted 2 hours, and it was very good discussion, as it always is with him. We were talking about, how we were going to vote. I know that he's kind of on the fence. And I was talking about how I was going to vote. And one of the things, my regret of the staircase when I left that podcast was I didn't say to him, Richard, let me tell you something about the Democrats. They're the party of shoplifting. They are a party that has taken the position that they are not going to prosecute and enforce the laws against theft. Okay, now how can you vote for these people? Friends don't let friends vote for the party of shoplifting. I mean, this is a core precept of our way of life. Thou shalt not steal. The sacredness of property, the founding fathers emphasized again and again the importance of the right to security in your property, the importance to prosperity, to stability, to industry, to every virtue, to our posterity, to accumulating wealth to pass down to our posterity, to family life, to businesses, to competition. I mean, it's connected to everything. If people can just come in and take your stuff, all right, our way of life, we will not keep our republic. We will slide back into third world squalor, which is pretty much reigns in the rest of the world. The world consists mostly of third world squalor, and these few places that have low corruption, rule of law, and protections for property, they are the ones that are the shining beacon on the hill where everybody wants to live. Why is that? So how can you vote for the party that rejects all of that? You can't. Apart from the candidates they run, I mean, I'm not here to praise Trump, right? But I would never vote for a Democrat because that is what they stand for. They stand for all the bad ideas, the worst possible things, which will inevitably lead to the destruction of our way of life. Now, what does this have to do with the question you asked? I consider the shoplifting party to be the party of extremists. That is an extremist position. I am sorry. To abandon thou shalt not steal, the pillar of secure ownership and property, which is the basis of our entire nation and our way of life, to abandon that? I mean, if that isn't extremism, I don't know what is.
Is the difficulty, though, that the Democratic Party is the party of the bourgeoisie in the economic, socio-economic sense, and you are shocking them?
Well, I mean, how am I shocking them? They shock me. But nobody seems to care. I tell my students, don't tell me that you're offended or upset by anything that's said in our seminar, because every morning when I open the New York Times, I'm offended. Do you think anybody cares?
Well, I suppose what I'm getting at is, when your statements, and, perhaps they need to be better contextualized or something, but when your statements like our country will be better off with more whites and fewer non-whites.
I never said that. You see, that's another statement that is taken, sliced out of a broader talk that I gave, in which I advocated for low and slow immigration, and mostly of people who were culturally compatible with our Western democratic society. And that was the position I took in that speech. And then I went on to say, now conservatives are going to be shy about that because it is going to lead to a certain demographic profile, and they will be accused of taking the position that we're better off with more whites and fewer non-whites. I said that might be one of the effects, but that's just a side effect. In fact, cultural compatibility and closeness is a good thing for our country, I think. I didn't say the country would be better. I did not make a declarative statement. I said this will be the accusation, and that accusation shouldn't stop us from adopting good policies. Partly, I mean, what I'm really saying is diversity is not the highest good. Quite the contrary. Diversity is not the highest good. There are other more important priorities, and I stand by that statement. But they take this this provocative soundbite and ignore the rest of my argument.
Well, then, I mean, you probably have quite a good case for suing the New York Times, because you're being quoted as saying that directly. And you also, women on average are less knowledgeable than men. They're less
There's lots
intellectual
of
than men.
evidence for that. The
You
Pew
said that.
Charitable Trust, a lefty organization, okay, released a study a few years ago that shows that women know less than men at every education level about science, about geopolitics, about geography, about, a whole host of topics. All right. That has been documented repeatedly. There's one study out of Britain that shows the only topic on which women controlling for education know more is fashion. Not even art. Men know more about art. There are a lot of different, nobody has ever said that's false. Here's the counter evidence. No one has ever said that. Here's a study that shows the opposite.
Well, that ties into something else you talk about, which is the feminization of academia, but also feminization of other institutions. And is it because our institutions are so feminized that we can't talk about, let's say, whether men are cleverer than women on average?
Well, I think it certainly contributes. It is documented that women assign a lower priority to rigor and truth-telling, and higher priorities to, there's survey data. This is not just one-off. There's a bunch of survey data that women assign higher priority to, sparing people's feelings, having people feel good about themselves, creating an equitable, inclusive atmosphere, and stuff along those lines. And men, on average, this is all average, of course, because there are exceptions. We understand that, or at least we should understand that, right? We're not talking about every single person. That's a straw man. Men assign higher priority to truth-seeking, to rigor, to, analysis, to evidence, empiricism, and the like. That's been documented. So it's not like I'm saying that without evidence. And I think that definitely affects the atmosphere in universities. When there are more women in universities, women's values and opinions start to gain the upper hand. And it is my position, and I stand by this, that the values, priorities that women favor are antithetical to the proper function of the university.
And as a woman yourself, you probably should have the sort of protected characteristic to be able to say such things.
Now, as you know, such protections are selective.
But let's talk a bit more broadly about the feminization of academia. How does it manifest itself? I mean, it's hard to describe, is it not?
Well, it's manifested itself in the way I've been treated. In the fact that even though, in the fact that I have been indicted, if you look at the accusations against me, the awful things I've said that form the basis for my behavioral violations, of course, that's just sophistry. That's speech and opinion. They just slap a different label on it, and no one challenges them. But most of what I've said is clearly true. So the fact that it's true doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is that it's inequitably targeted disrespect, whatever the hell that is. That's a made-up phrase that my university came up with to characterize my infractions. Inequitably targeted disrespect. Of course, there's inequitably targeted disrespect is everywhere, as you know. But for example, one of my infractions was saying in a discussion, an academic discussion somewhere, that on average blacks have lower cognitive ability than whites. Well, they do. That's been documented maybe 100 times, and there's no study to the contrary. It's an unfortunate fact, but it's a fact. The American Psychological Association has twice officially stated that that is a valid statement. All right, that is a valid statement. So, the fact that it's true doesn't save me. You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that, women are less knowledgeable than men. You're not supposed to make any statement that makes people feel bad about themselves, whether or not it represents reality, whether or not it's true. You're not supposed to say that, the black out of wedlock birth rate is 73%, which is an undeniable fact. That makes people feel bad. I could go on and on. I could go on and on of the kinds of statements that blacks have higher rates of crime, and especially violent crime.
Why is it that the culture that means that you can't say these things is feminine? I mean, why is it not that it's infantile or frightened or counter? Is it particularly feminine, that culture?
Well, I mean, it's both feminine and infantile, because as I've said, those prescriptions, the inability to deal with the data and then move on from the data. The data doesn't prove anything about what policies we should have, about how we should deal with such a thing. It's just the beginning of the discussion, right? The beginning of what, could be a very interesting and nuanced discussion, actually. But I've said that, the feminization of standards and practices brings into the academy the rules of the nursery and the kindergarten. The rules of the nursery and the kindergarten are, we have to encourage everyone, tell everyone how amazing they are, never say anything negative or critical, never make anybody feel bad about themselves. It's the warm bath theory of education, basically. And, but that somehow is the way to get people to learn. I frankly don't think it's the way to get people to learn. I think there is a role for encouraging people, for supporting people, but it can't be the all of it, because sometimes you have to tell people things they don't want to hear. I remember years ago advising a minority student who was in one of my classes, a good student, very curious, very serious. And when he/she wrote a paper for me, I'm trying to anonymize this person. It was really poorly written, quite bad. And I said to the person, you are not a good writer. You're a terrible writer. And that is going to hold you back as a lawyer. That is going to haunt you in your attempt to get ahead. And you need to face up to it. And you need to work. You need to just start from scratch, work your butt off to improve your writing. Okay, I don't care whether it's fair or just or why this happened or whatever. Like, forget the blame game. Just go forward. And you're going to have to work really hard. And I actually sat down with the person and I blue penciled their paper. I tried to show them where the problems were. That's very time consuming. And nowadays, like, you wouldn't bother because, they probably complain about you and how you were discriminating against them. I mean, one of my former students told me that in her law firm, when a Black young woman student associate was brought on the carpet for inadequate work, she just said, well, that's racism. That the only reason you're saying that is because of racism. That's the answer to everything.
Mm. And I've seen videos of you where you express disappointment with men, that men don't stand up against what you're describing more. Why do you think men don't?
Oh heavens. I mean, I don't know. It's probably a mix of many different factors.
Have we been
Yeah.
feminized?
I mean, I've gotten very interesting and thoughtful emails on this particular point. I got one from a scientist not long ago that was quite intriguing. He's probably in his late middle age right now. He told me this at a pretty prominent university, and he said, it's a little bit like boiling the frog. We allowed these small changes, we let them go. Women wanted, standards to be changed. They wanted the language to be changed. They wanted the conditions to be changed, the metrics whereby we evaluated people, all of these different changes that feminists have wanted in order to get a better result. For women, he said, we just allowed each and every one, and then all of a sudden the frog boiled and everything was, we turned up the heat bit by bit and we had a boiled frog on our hands. Everything kind of collapsed. So we weren't willing to resist the increments because he said, we're scientists, we're busy, we're doing our own research. We don't want to fight the battle. We want to get along with people. We want to be nice. We want to be known as pro-feminist. We want to be modern and hip and progressive and all of these good things because they've all become moralized. You see, that's part of the trick that the wokeistas have very cleverly imposed. And, the wokeistas are pretty clever because a lot of them are smart people, which is to create this kind of Manichaean world in which good people allow all this to happen or even promote it. And bad, evil people like me stand athwart history and say either stop or slow down. Just yesterday, I got an email. I get so much mail. This is takes up my whole life now because of my notoriety. But I do learn a lot of interesting things through the mail I get. But most of the mail I get is positive and encouraging. But yesterday, I got a very interesting email from a young Korean woman. She even signed her name. Okay. And I could dredge up this email and I could read it to you. But here's basically what it said. It said, you are a bad person. You are evil. You do not even deserve to walk the face of the earth. You don't deserve a job. You don't deserve health care. You don't deserve a bank account. You deserve to be run out of polite society on a rail. It goes on in this vein. Okay. And what's so interesting about this message is that it exemplifies the transmogrification of our democratic society from, neighbors, citizens, people who disagree and disagree civilly, the concept of a loyal opposition, which is very unnatural, right? Because the natural impulse is to crush our enemies, to crush those who disagree with us. But the founding fathers were very conscious that was not going to work. I mean, Madison was obsessed with faction. What do we do about faction? How do we keep faction under control? And how do we structure our republic so that people who disagree, which is inevitable, he said, where there is liberty, there will be disagreement. There will be a range of opinion. That's ineradicable. How do we structure our government first so that people who disagree have to deal with each other, right? So actually, the Senate, the Electoral College, there's a way of looking at all of that stuff that forces people to deal with voters on the margin, disagreement, red states to deal with blue states, and the opposite, right? All of that stuff is there. And how do we keep people from demonizing, punishing, crushing those who disagree? Because once we do that, as Benjamin Franklin said, we will not keep our republic. And so this woman who's from, is Korean. So, well, I hate to say it, but that culture is not our culture. It is not the culture that really sees the loyal opposition as central to a viable democratic society. It's not part of their tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound sort of oversensitive, but I mean, that is just one Korean person writing you a loony email. I think you could quite easily find an American who'd write you an
Sure,
email.
of course. And I am sure that this attitude has spread. But it has been enabled from multiple quarters. One of the quarters is a kind of indigenous American progressivism, right, that demonizes the opposition. I'm not denying that. But it's also fed by the springs of multiculturalism, right, of accommodating points of view that are, not at the core of our shared values, shall we say. So it's a kind of unholy brew of all of that. And of course, this is not the only instance. I mean, I have friends who are on the right who have been demonized, persecuted. Attempts have been made through lawfare and other methodologies, both formal and informal, to wipe them out, to crush them, to destroy them. The organization VDARE is a very good example. This was an organization run by a friend of mine named Peter Brimelow, and it is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and defending the Anglo-Protestant traditions and our constitutional traditions. It's very much anti-mass migration, anti-immigration, wants low and slow levels of immigration, and it has ceased to exist because there has been a campaign against it. I won't go into the details, both on the formal and informal level. These organizations can't even get a bank to cash their checks or open a bank account. They can't get hotels to sponsor their meetings or their gatherings. I mean, there is this kind of systematic campaign of persecution against what is considered far-right organizations, right? As John McWhorter say, organizations that have opinions that no reasonable people would embrace, except they have very big memberships, right? Or substantial memberships. So that is what is going on in our country now, and it's very dangerous and kind of scary.
Do you think, is it sounding too gloomy to say that we are reaching the end of the Enlightenment?
Well, as a conservative, the conservatives have always had a kind of ambivalent relationship to the Enlightenment, so we're like two cheers for the Enlightenment. But only in the sense that we don't see reason as, the highest good, that respect for tradition and longstanding habits and practices, which can't always be justified and explained by reason, is part of the conservative commitment or approach to life. So that's what I mean by that. But because there has been such an assault on the fundamental tenets of the Enlightenment on the left, on the progressive left, right? Conservatives have kind of stepped into the role of defending the Enlightenment, or at least what's good about the Enlightenment, right? Which is rule of law, Whiggish suspicion towards big government and abuses of power, rationality, evidence, rigor, reason, all of that, the meritocracy, expertise, where there's genuine expertise and the like. So, yeah, I think that all of that stuff is under threat. It's under threat by a kind of unholy brew of postmodern thought, which is very much a Western outgrowth, of course, plus this multicultural dogma which is very anti-Western as well, or sub-Western, pre-Enlightenment. And when you put those two together, it's a real threat.
And is your area of expertise is the law? Is it because the law has turned, perhaps quite dramatically in the last few decades, that the Enlightenment is facing an existential threat?
Well, I wouldn't say because. I would say the fact that the rule of law values have weakened, which they have, is a kind of symptom of turning against the Enlightenment. I mean, it's part and parcel of the phenomenon. And, it has been happening on a lot of different fronts. The turning away from rigor, from reason, from, and even the core tenets of the American Republic, which is personal responsibility, equality of opportunity, protections for property, the relationship between effort and reward, as Richard Weaver would say, all of that is going on in multiple spheres in our society. And law is just one of them. Now, rule of law and consistency and evidence-based rigor and justice, due process to ensure that the law gets it right, that's a very, very important piece of it. That is a very, very, without that, we slide back into third worldism. We do. We have struggled mightily through great sacrifice to produce the kind of society that we have, and it's very fragile. So we are definitely in danger of backsliding. We're in the process of backsliding right now, actually.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we should end it there. But Amy Wax, thank you very much for coming on to the Americano show. It's been fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me.